In this video, we are going to talk about venous return of blood back to the heart. Keep in mind that the left ventricle is the pump for the systemic circulation, which circulates arterial blood throughout the whole body. Initially, upon exiting the left ventricle, blood is propelled with a very high pressure, roughly 120 millimeters of mercury. But once that blood gets dispersed throughout the whole body, throughout the whole arterial system, and at the capillaries, the pressure of arterial blood moving into the meta-arterioles is roughly 40 millimeters of mercury. When that blood leaves the capillary into the venules, it's down to about 25 millimeters of mercury. And by the time blood gets back to the right atrium via the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava, pressure can be in the single digits, around 5 millimeters of mercury. So it's incumbent on the body to be creative in finding ways to create these pressure gradients, finding ways to decrease the size of these veins, to increase the pressure in the veins, to allow blood to continue flowing back to the heart. And this is especially pertinent to any blood returning to the heart inferior to the heart. So blood draining the brain back to the heart is not faced with this challenge because it's being aided by gravity. But blood coming up from the big toe, anywhere below the diaphragm, and certainly anywhere below the heart is going to be opposing gravity, and it's also going to have very low pressure. So in this video, we're going to talk about two mechanisms that help propel blood superiorly back to the heart. The first mechanism is the skeletal muscle pump. So what we see in this image right here in purple are muscles, skeletal muscle, let's say in the leg. So we could pretend this is the gastrocnemius muscle, the soleus muscle. And we have blood vessels that run through these muscles en route back to the heart. We have veins running through these muscles. And what I'm showing here is just the tunica intima of the vein, which is the endothelium that contains these one-way valves that we talked about previously that prevent backflow of blood, prevent blood from falling inferiorly during times of low pressure. Now, there is a mistake in this image right here, and there should not be a constriction of the blood vessel right here. So just pretend that this blood vessel is not squeezed at this point right here. But we need something to squeeze this blood vessel to create a pressure gradient. And these skeletal muscles, when they contract merely by the action of walking, and it could be even standing up, the slight contraction of these blood vessels are going to narrow the lumen of the blood vessel. And by narrowing the lumen, we are decreasing the volume of the blood vessel, increasing pressure, causing blood to move superiorly. Now, certainly, blood's not going to move inferiorly because of these one-way valves. This is what's known as the skeletal muscle pump. Skeletal muscle pump. Once again, the skeletal muscle pump utilizes the mechanical event of muscle contraction to narrow the lumen of large veins, and by decreasing the lumen of the large veins, decreasing the volume of this chamber, pressure is increased to a degree that it's going to push blood superiorly. And this skeletal muscle pump achieves this in regions below the waist, below the belt. That is to say, up through the legs, because we have all these muscles in our legs that within the muscles, we have veins proceeding superiorly back to the heart. And once those muscles contract, it squeezes on these veins. So think about being on a long airplane flight. Very few people can just sit in their seat for a long flight. And let's say the flight is at least 5 hours, maybe as long as 12 or even longer. Individuals tend to stand up and walk around, walk back and forth up and down aisles. And they're doing this unknowingly to get their blood flowing. They become agitated, and the body just needs blood flowing back to the heart so it can send that blood ultimately to the lungs, breathe out the CO2, and get more oxygen to the brain. So walking up and down the aisles of a plane, or any time we're getting up and walking around because we're restless, what is really happening is activation of this skeletal muscle pump to push blood superiorly to the heart. The other mechanism that aids in the venous return of blood back to the heart is what's known as the respiratory pump. And the respiratory pump is aided by this very broad muscle right here that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. And this is the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is the main muscle of respiration. During inhalation, the diaphragm moves down or is depressed inferiorly, as you can see by these arrows. During inhalation, when that diaphragm depresses, moves inferiorly, it is decreasing the volume of the abdominal cavity. By decreasing the volume of this chamber, the chamber being the abdominal cavity, pressure is going to increase in the abdominal cavity. And that increased pressure is going to squeeze on this inferior vena cava that is within the abdominal cavity to push blood superiorly. Keep in mind, blood is not going to move inferiorly because of the one-way valves. So the respiratory pump is going to propel blood in the abdominal cavity superiorly during inhalation. Okay, so we just talked about blood moving through the diaphragm. So now there's blood within the inferior vena cava superior to the diaphragm, but it is still not in the right atrium. And that's where venous blood needs to be returned to. During exhalation, the diaphragm is relaxed. It's pushed superiorly. The volume of the thoracic cavity is decreasing in size. The decreased volume of the chamber being the thoracic cavity, is going to increase pressure within the thoracic cavity. And that increased pressure is going to squeeze on the inferior vena cava, diminishing the diameter of the inferior vena cava, increasing the pressure within that blood vessel to move the final blood back into the right atrium. And that is the respiratory pump. Keep in mind, the skeletal muscle pump is functioning within the legs, everything below the belt. But above the belt, we don't have legs or arms within our abdominal cavity to squeeze on these blood vessels. So we rely on the movements of the diaphragm up and down to modify the volume of the abdominal cavity and the thoracic cavity. So the two mechanisms that aid venous return of blood back to the heart, specifically below the heart and below the diaphragm, is the skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory pump.